Okay, thanks everybody. I have the distinct honor of introducing our third panel of the day. As a reminder, we started off with a discussion on strategy, then moved to a discussion on jointness with the vice chairs. Then we had a discussion on the intelligence picture from the DNI and then the chairman, the last session. We now move to panel 3, which is a call to arms, mobilizing industry and unlocking innovation. My name is Seth Jones. I'm the director of the International Security Program at CSIS, and I have the distinct honor of welcoming the Honorable Bill Lynn, CEO of Leonardo DRS. Thanks, Bill. You've been a great friend of CSIS over the years. Bill is also former Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Honorable Heidi Shyu, Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. The Honorable Dr. William LaPlante, Bill LaPlante, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And then Chris Brose, Chief Strategy Officer for Anduril Industries, and also I told him I'd give him a plug for his book, Kill Chain, which I was reading the other night, actually, a section of it. So it is still relevant. And then going to hand this over as moderator to Gordon Lubold of the Wall Street Journal. So Gordon, over to you for a great panel. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Seth. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for sticking with us. We have a great panel here. I would just kind of briefly say by way of introduction, the world seems completely on fire. I don't need to tell this audience. And what we're trying to do is to get a better sense from this expert panel about kind of what all that means for the industrial base, for the U.S. government, for the ability to get tech and innovation to warfighter, what all these different things that we're seeing in the headlines mean in that context. But what I like to do when I do these panels, I've done them before, and I like to joke. It's not a good joke, but I mean, I ask many of the same questions, and sometimes I wonder why we're still here asking the same questions, getting the same answers. Hopefully we get some new answers today. But what I like to do is just go one by one here, really briefly, if we could. No filibustering, no speeches, but just give us a sense, give our audience a sense of the world as you see it in this context, and then we can get to some questions. But Heidi, you go ahead first. But please, I want to keep it short so we can get to questions.
Yes, sir. Got it. 2 minutes or less. Obviously, I agree with you. The world's on fire, so we need to deliver capabilities as quickly as possible to our warfighters. So the things that we're going to focus on, hopefully I'll get a chance literally to talk about some innovative systems that we're pushing through, not just prototyping, but experimenting and in exercises and working very collaboratively with my partner right here, Dr. Bill LaPlante, in terms of accelerating production. So I'll be happy to chat a little bit about that.
Oh, I mean, you get a prize when you get to your time back later. Good. Bill, please.
Yeah, thanks. And needless to say, it's a cliche to say the world's at an inflection point. It's an inflection point all the time. I think that there is something happening. I wouldn't say it's going to a wartime footing. It's not. It is for Russia. Russia's at a wartime footing. I would say in Europe and to now with the supplemental of the United States, we're moving past the post-Cold War era and actually starting to get our industrial capacity, starting to get it up again and get it to where it needs to be. It's not where it needs to be. It's going to continue to take years to do this. Everybody, I think, around the world is recognizing this. And so you're going to be seeing more and more announcements about code development, not unlike what Heidi's been working on with the Japanese on glide phase intercept, co-production, like the Gimlers in Australia or the GEM-Ts in Germany, and co-sustainment, like the regional framework, sustainment framework and the MROs we're setting up around the world with other countries. That's where this is all headed.
You guys are all getting A's so far. Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Thanks, Gordon. I agree with you. Obviously, the world has gotten hotter for us with not only the pacing threat in China, but with Ukraine and now the Middle East, and who knows where North Korea is going, and obviously Iran has just lashed out. I mean, I think the question is how is industry and the industrial complex in the department going to respond? I think it has to respond by dealing with three longer-term trends. We could explore more length, but just to tick them off. One is just what Bill, I think, was talking about, is the internationalization of the defense enterprise. The U.S. has always had great technology, but increasingly we don't have all of it. And if we're going to get the best technology to the warfighter, we're going to have to look broader than just at home. The second has been going on since the end of the Cold War, is the consolidation of defense industry, and how we deal with that. We're seeing that now with capacity limitations, but there's also limitations on competition, and we're seeing it now with the submarine industrial base. Is how are we going to expand enough to be able to meet the 2 per year goal on attack submarines rather than the 1+ where we are. I think that's a diversity of suppliers. It's not a new nuclear yard, but there's got to have to be creative approaches to that. And then the third trend is commercialization of defense technology, or by what I mean by that is more and more this origin of defense technologies on the commercial side of the ledger. I mean, defense used to be its own development, almost a little bit of a cocoon, and was a net exporter of technology. Think GPS, even the internet itself. Now it's clearly a net importer, whether it's AI or autonomy. And so how we adapt the industry to pull those technologies in and provide them to the front lines, I think, is going to be a defining variable.
Okay, got it. Thanks very much. Chris, go ahead.
Appreciate it. Love being on the stage with the honorable, the honorable, the honorable, and then I guess I'm like the not honorable or the dishonorable. So I will do my part to play my role. Look, I guess take a step back. Like, how I see the world is that the United States, from a defense and military standpoint, is in a state of disruption. And this is a hard thing to get our heads around, right? I mean, we have been top of the heap, front of the pack for a generation. And we have thought about how we build and project military power a certain way. We have a limited number of things. They're really expensive, really exquisite. They're hard to build. They're hard to replace. Not many companies can build them. And they rest on a set of assumptions about things that we think we'll always have access to: command and control, space, comms, the electromagnetic spectrum, basing, logistics. And all of those things are now increasingly being held at risk and called into question by choices that our adversaries are consciously making. In China's case, the better part of a generation. Russia, Iran, less so. But they, as I think Bill alluded to, they're all increasingly working together and seeing this as an integrated problem. And I think the hardest problem, the hardest thing that we have to get our heads around is this failure of imagination, that we are off by an order of magnitude in terms of what it is actually going to take to qualitatively and quantitatively marshal kind of not just the industrial base, but a different kind of industrial base, a technological industrial base, to field the kinds of systems at the kinds of scales, at the kinds of prices that are going to be required to be competitive, and then to sustain that over what are likely going to be protracted competitions and protracted conflicts.
Interesting. I was going to ask something else, but you just touched on something I wanted to get to quick, and somebody actually suggested this, and I thought it was a decent question, which is, the DIB is very good at producing a lot of small things, bullets, ammo, even small arms and stuff, but not so great so far in producing at scale. We'll talk more about scaling later too, but not so good about producing at scale the kinds of things that we need for these fights now. Why don't I just throw that out there for anybody and you can jump in, but so the question is, do you agree and why?
Well, I'd just try it. I don't think it's a simple answer. Actually, the DoD has not been really doing a lot of production over the past, since the end of the Cold War.
DoD as a partner with industry.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
With the Defense Industrial Base,
sure,
has not been doing a lot of production. That's been actually part of the concern. People were surprised is why can't they just ramp up production overnight and get a third line, renegotiate your labor rates. No, they haven't had to do it. They're actually not very nimble to do it. What we have to do is fund that. So that's point one. So it's more complicated than that. I think the second point is that I say production is deterrence, and somebody from kind of the new technology area, I was talking to them and they said, well, we don't use that terminology, we use something else. I said, well, if you produce a lot of iPhones, what are you doing? Manufacturing. I said, oh, okay, so manufacturing is deterrence. So it's not really, I mean, I think that the real thing, which is we've had many of these conversations, is there has to be a market that will pay for the thing at mass scale, whether it's a commercial market or a government market or a combination thereof. Otherwise, people are just building manufacturing things with nobody to fund it.
Sure.
And no business case.
And is the market issue a function of the uncertain budgetary thing, or is it
We've generally well, munitions is an easy answer. Munitions, we've generally dialed down to the minimal number, and we've gone below it for the last 30 years. And then to the extent that we have funded up during crisis, it's always funded up, and then about 2 years later, we crush it. So if you're an industry, you're an investor, I'd be very cautious investing CapEx in a production line if I didn't have a multi-year contract or some type of surety, which we're now getting. That's why we push the multi-year contracts. Otherwise, you're just going to get burned, and they've been burned before. So people aren't going to fund production lines unless they think there's a return on investment.
Right.
And it takes money. You're just not going to do it out of your CapEx. Now, some companies, to their credit, are leaning forward and doing it, but they're at risk in doing that, and we have to make sure that they get rewarded when they do it.
Could I add to that? I mean, I want to build on Bill's point. I agree with everything. I would submit the problem is harder in the sense that it's not clear to me that we can actually scale what we are currently buying to the degrees that we are actually going to need it. When you look at the kind of the defense program and the industrial base that builds it predominantly, we are building things in dozens and hundreds and maybe low thousands. They are extremely exquisite systems. They are extremely expensive. They are hard to build. The processes by which they are built are very manual. They are very artisanal. It is not possible to scale that only but so far. You could throw $11 trillion at it and wait for a couple of decades, and maybe we'll get there. But again, I would submit there's a term for that, which is luxury goods. And we need luxury goods. I'm all in favor of luxury goods, despite the fact that I don't own any. We just need another sort of type of military capability, which is mass producible, that we can have and replenish quickly. If we believe our future wars are going to be wars of loss and attrition and regeneration, I can't regenerate things that take me years to build. They need to be things like Tesla's, where I can field thousands out of a single factory every single week. That I would submit as the type of military power we're going to need in the future to complement the kind of luxury power that we have been reliant upon.
Interesting. Heidi.
Yeah. So I want to chime into that as well. One of the things that we have a pot of funding for is Appit, right? Accelerate procurement and fielding of innovative technology. That is primarily geared towards small companies. So literally to fulfill the valley of death. Namely, if you demonstrated capability, you need to get into low-rate initial production, and we have a 2-year budget cycle. So once you demonstrate your capability, you got to wait 2 to 2 years until we palm it. So there's a gap. Okay. So Appit actually helped to build the bridge across this gap. And I will say a lot of things that we were able to fund are, for example, helping a small company that's building unmanned surface vehicles. They're doing it manually, right? So we're able to help them to literally buy a robotics welder. So they were able to go from 1 manual line to 8 automated production lines. So this is the kind of capability we're leveraging Appit Funding to help ramp up the low-rate production rate for small companies.
Okay, I'll follow up on some of those. My broader question, I think Bill touched on it briefly, is for the defense industrial base, for the USG in partner, was Ukraine indeed like a 9/11 moment? Is the U.S. on a wartime footing? Is the U.S. industrial base on a wartime footing? Yes or no, and why not?
It's not on a wartime footing if you consider World War II to be the world where we converted General Motors and Ford factories into tank factories. Yes, we did talk to the car companies about doing that. I think that I can't underemphasize or overemphasize, the importance of funding, because the industrial base is not going to do anything without funding. And so what really was the game changer, if you want to call it that, for Ukraine was the initial supplemental. Right. Once that supplemental hit, then people are like, there's real money coming. You can't just sit there and say, where's the demand signal? The demand signal's coming. So that was the real change. And I can't emphasize how much we have begun to rebuild the industrial base with the supplementals. There is now factories breaking ground around the country, Texas, all around the country, out of these supplementals that we've gotten for Ukraine. It's a start, but that was the real change. Calling it a wartime footing, no, the Russians are going to just an open source, 3 shifts a day, 24/7, sort of conscripting people. I don't know that we're conscripting people in this country. They're at, depending on what you believe, 6 to 7% of their GDP is spent on military. We're at about 3.2. So they're going all out. We're not doing that. And reminder, in World War II, at the peak of World War II, which is probably deceptive, we were about 40% of GDP on military. Even at 1987, the end of the Cold War, we were about 6-7%. We're at 3.2%. That's not a wartime footing.
Is it a false premise? I mean, should we be on a wartime footing?
It's a political will question. It's a political will question. Does the country and the democracy have the political will to be at a wartime footing or not? That's the decision that needs to be made. It was clearly made, that decision was made in World War II. I'm not suggesting it should or it shouldn't, but that's a political question.
Gentlemen?
Back up a step. I go back to what Chris said. I think you can't underestimate, I like his word, disruption. The disruption that particularly Ukraine had. I mean, we were on a path towards, starting with Jim Mattis and that strategy, towards focusing on near-peer competitors. And we had started to build it away from counterterror. But I think Vladimir Putin made it here and now. And I don't think we're expecting that. And then Xi, in a less dramatic way, is pulled forward the Taiwan. I mean, we were really focused on deterring Taiwan. Now we're thinking about, do we have to fight it? Now, obviously, they're related if you fight it. Sure. And I think it's Ukraine, beyond that, I think illustrated the limitations that our force that was developed for counterterror had in terms of dealing with a near-peer adversary, particularly when you get beyond the first week of the war. And that it's not that surprising, given that the wars that we fought in the last 2 or 3 decades have either been counterterror or they've been very quick. I mean, Iraq twice, and you measure them in hours or days or at most weeks. So those capacity issues that we have now, which should have seemed obvious, have been made much more dramatic. So I think this is, although you could have predicted it, we didn't. And so I think it's the response, it's not all that slow. We've been moving within 24 months to put in place the capacity to deal with those types of threats. So I think the system is reacting to what is the new reality, but I think it is a disruption of the world as we knew it.
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is we don't know yet. But I would say the very fact that we're having this discussion is, to me, suggestive of the fact that, like, it might be. Right? I have a lot of friends who kind of ascribe to the idea that, Ukraine, Middle East is just a complete distraction, waste of time. We should be husbanding our resources for China. Put aside the fact that, like, those may actually be the wrong resources. I mean, if we're shooting stingers and javelins at the Chinese, we probably lost a long time ago. I don't think it's a distraction insofar as we are learning lessons about ourselves through the crises that we are dealing with that I am glad we are learning now, rather than, God forbid, in the teeth of a Chinese Taiwan contingency. And I think to Bill's point about a wartime footing, which is totally a political question, I might use a different word. It's more of a strategic footing in the sense that in order to deter, you have to have productive capacity, surge capacity to demonstrate to your adversary not only that you are capable of having a fight, but that you can sustain it every bit as long, if not longer, than they can, and this is going to turn out badly for them. I do not think that our adversaries are deterred when they look at our posture right now, our spending right now, our industrial base right now, the composition of our defense program. But I think those things are starting to change. Again, the fact that we're having these discussions, that money is flowing, that factories are opening, and certainly we're doing a lot of that at Anduril. To me, that is indicative that we are starting a process, but, like, boy, does it have to go to scale a lot faster in order to have the effect that we want.
Yeah, this is why I keep coming back to this let's say co-production, maybe even co-sustainment thing. I actually believe that if you, just an observer in national security, observe around the world, cooperative production popping up in Australia, popping up in Europe, it'll get your attention. You'll be like, wow, so they're not just producing the stuff in the United States, they're producing the stuff around the world, and there's stuff that was developed by another country we're producing in the United States. That's starting to really, that'll get my attention. And again, we've shown in Ukraine, we can move really, really fast. We get contracting done within a couple of weeks. We get stuff moving right away. Literally right now, there are planes flying probably with equipment to Ukraine. All we need is to sign the bill and we're gone. We're writing contracts this afternoon. That's not the issue. The issue is, can we set up what Chris is getting at, a global industry sounds old fashioned, but manufacturing and deterrence that people can say, oh, these guys are serious. They're not messing around. They're not just building a few, or they're not doing a few hypersonics demos and then waiting a little bit. They're actually serious.
Yeah, so I'd like to chime in. We are working very collaboratively with a lot of countries, right? Give you examples, even in the area of ramjet engines, right? Yeah. We're working closely with Norway, and they're designing a system that could fulfill their needs as well as our needs. They tested 300 times and brought it over here last summer to test within our range. It was highly successful. So they're establishing manufacturing in Florida. So we're absolutely collaborating. And the other thing is Aussies are fantastic partners, right?
They love hiding. They love hiding.
They're fantastic partners. We went down to look at what capability that they have that can bring huge advantage if we integrate things together. We're exactly down that path.
But I guess just to kind of expand on this a little bit and stay on this a little bit, has the experience of the last 2 years with the added distraction, we want to talk a little bit about distractions in a minute, but has the U.S. created a blueprint for what it will need to do, or at least to bastardize Rumsfeld, does it know what it doesn't know or whatever, for if and when there is a fight down the line in another part of the world, have the pieces come together so that the different components of government and industry know what would need to be done if it really, forgive me if the shit gets real?
We do. I mean, not that we know everything, but yeah, we pretty much do.
What are the lessons that we've...
Well, I hate to say it, but the fact that it took us 6 to 8 months to get this supplemental kind of shakes up a lot of people abroad, because it sends to them a signal that, the United States can rush real fast and start leading the world, which we were, and then they'll just stop and wait for our political system to start up again. So I think that actually had a big impact around the world, much bigger, I think, than people realize, because then you're not reliable. Because to do all the things we're talking about, you have to have resourcing to do it. And if the resourcing is, every time we try to go resourcing, we're all up in the air, and we make 6 months to decide whether we're going to do it, that's pretty uncertain.
I think the other thing is, it's not just a kinetic piece that we're looking at. We're looking at kinetic and non-kinetic across vast systems of systems. And we're tying pieces together, sensor to the shooter, right, in a highly, highly contested fight. So.
But are those systems, I mean, they're not quite ready to, I assume you're talking about like JADC2 and some of these other things, but I mean, those systems aren't fully operational and fielded.
I would say, as a part of the radar activity last summer, we went forward with multiple activity, went through the DMAG, demonstrated capability, and we're scaling up. Okay, so some of these capability I can't talk about.
Are there ways to describe it around the classifications? Because I think sometimes we get bogged down in classifications and nobody can talk about things that are probably, there's some way to talk about around the classifications. Is that the case here?
I'm going after the kill web, okay?
Okay.
That's it.
I don't know what that means exactly.
There's a book called Kill Chain you all need to read.
It's all unclassified, I promise.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Just a quick interjection on that. I mean, when I hear blueprint of how we have done it over the past 2 years, what I would want to guard against is the belief that somehow we don't need new programs for the future. I think that in order to be competitive, if we're talking about China, I don't think having more of what we have is necessarily the answer. I think we're going to need weapons and autonomous systems and larger scale capabilities of that type that are mass producible. Again, we're not talking about photon torpedoes and cloaking devices. We're talking about technology that exists now that can be rapidly turned into programs and scaled into production. We're going to need a lot more of those things that can be mass produced, that can be replaced quickly when we take combat losses, which we will, of a type of what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think those to me are the lessons we need to be learning, and then we need to be building for the future to say, sure, there are certain things that we are doing now that we need more of, but boy, do we need a lot of different types of capabilities that are going to take a different form.
Yeah, just 2 points. One, just to pile on what Chris is saying. A reminder, we always have to remind ourselves, like even when we get, knock on wood, get all this stuff to the Ukrainians, and with all respect to the Ukrainians, the way they're fighting in Ukraine is not necessarily the way we would fight. So the answer isn't to give them more of things that, to Chris's point, that are things that are legacy. Now they do need them right now because otherwise they're actually going to be overrun. But to win, you need something. You need the other stuff, the stuff that Chris is alluding to, and that's the game changers that are either in the kill webs, long-range strike, the kinetic and non-kinetic, and the rest of it. So I think that what Chris said is really, really important. We don't want to over-learn lessons from Ukraine. They're fighting necessarily so in a way that we would not necessarily fight. The second point I'd like to make is what he said about the equipment. One thing we are learning about Ukraine is that, to oversimplify, Ukraine's got a lot of stuff from a lot of people. It's lovingly called the zoo. They have the zoo, as my colleague in Ukraine says all the time. And to kind of over-exaggerate, but not really, they'll use whatever you give them, and they'll be really creative with it. If it doesn't work or it breaks and they can't fix it, they'll throw it aside and get something else. To the point of where we're telling, when Friday I chaired a meeting with the National Armaments Directors, 50 countries on Ukraine, and I told everybody, know the mission capable rates of what you're delivering to the Ukrainians. Is it 20%? Is it 70%? And what's the reason that if it's at 20%, why? Is it spares? Is it you didn't translate the manuals? And by the way, if you have to send the equipment back to a European country, to Poland or somewhere else to get repaired, that's not great. Can we repair it in country? So what we're seeing right now in Ukraine is, after you have first contact with the enemy, you have all types of battle damage, all types of regular attrition that you have to keep up and you have to go, because again, sustainment really matters.
So that's interesting because so there's lessons to be learned, but not to be learned from Ukraine in particular. But I'm always kind of interested in this distraction question. The U.S. had a plan. And maybe in this case, the Biden administration was like, the pivot's going to be real this time. We're going to focus on China, national defense strategy, all the rest of it. And then funny thing happened on the way to Asia, Ukraine, now the Middle East. I'm always kind of curious what this fight in the Middle East means for the long term. But I guess my real question for now is, are there perils that the U.S. does take too many lessons from these fights that are not going to look like the one that the U.S. may fight down the line?
I think there's always that, Gordon. I mean, my old boss, Bob Gates, used to say, we have a perfect record of predicting when and where we're going to fight. Right. We've always gotten it wrong.
All right.
And so and I think that is going to be correct. If you want to be a global, if we are a global superpower, you can't afford to focus geographically or to specialize. We have to have a full spectrum of capabilities because the threats are going to be unpredictable. I mean, yeah, Ukraine, Putin was a surprise, but we're always going to face surprises. So we have to build a full spectrum military. And that's what worries me about the budget we're in right now. It's a flattish budget. It's at a high peacetime level, but it's not really a peacetime threat. It's getting very close in Taiwan to a wartime threat in Ukraine. We're already there, but we have a flat budget, which in its nature forces trade-offs, and you can see them right now. We're giving up the future or giving up pushing the future out a few years. We're pushing any ship with an X out, just got delayed. We took a submarine out, which is 7-8 years out. We canceled one of the Army helicopters, and we're building more of the current platforms. That's an inevitable trade-off, but it's a dangerous one going along the lines. Chris, we're going to have to build new kinds of different systems. If we have to sacrifice the current inventory to do that, we're taking a very strong near-term risk, and we better be right. The better approach is a higher budget, but as Bill was talking about, I think the support in Congress is there for it, but it's so dysfunctional, they can't operationalize.
Right.
That you have strong bipartisan majorities for it, but you don't allow them to vote. Or at least it's that in many ways, I think that political dysfunction is the biggest national security threat.
Yeah, I guess I'd take the other side and say my bigger concern is we don't learn enough of the lessons that we're seeing. And I totally agree. Ukraine is fighting a different kind of war, a different kind of threat than what we might, God forbid, face in the Indo-Pacific. But I think there are enough trends that should be jarring to us, right? In terms of the illumination of the battlefield, how hard it is to hide, the volume of fires that you have to contend with. Again, this war of production and loss and replenishment that we're now sort of competing industrial base to industrial base, wars that are going to take time and become protracted rather than things that we think are going to be over in a matter of days or weeks. Those to me are lessons that shake the assumptions of the United States military to its foundation. Because we have not built our military based on those assumptions. And I would submit that when you take a much harder version of that problem, which is what China has been building for 25 to 30 years, projecting power into the teeth of that is going to be hard, hiding is going to be hard, accessing all of these things that we take for granted, our enabling capabilities is going to be hard. I'm sort of more worried about how many people in the Department of Defense who are managing programs of record and sort of thinking about out-year budgeting are saying, how should I be changing what I am planning to do based on what I am seeing happening in real time in front of me? There's this view that the future of war is this thing that's going to happen to us in 10 years, and we've got a lot of time to get ready for it. And I would submit it's happening right now, and we're going to miss a lot of the lessons if we're not paying attention.
Tom, okay, good point.
Yeah, the Defense Science Board used to be asked every 3 years to do studies on surprise, echoing what Secretary Gates used to say is, why do we always get surprised? And they came up with this concept of true surprises and then known surprises. And known surprises are things we really know, we just pretend like we're surprised. I'll give you an example, of one that we know and yet we pretend like we're surprised. I was surprised at the beginning of Ukraine that the RF spectrum was actually usable. I just assumed, a lot of us assumed, that the RF spectrum would be gone, internet would be gone, all that stuff. It didn't go away right away. Well, it's sort of now happening, at least on the RF spectrum. So if you rely on your system, relies on RF energy for your navigation or your PNT, if you want to call it that, SATCOM or whatever, or rely on it for your command and control, you're going to be out of Schlitz. And if you fix it and you put a receiver on there with good signal noise ratio and you got a nice little antenna on there and it flywheels through with a good IMU and Kalman filter, you're like, I'm good. Yeah, wait till 2 weeks from now. The Russians will figure out. And the other piece of it you have to remember, and this gets to this idea of very cheap many things, the idea of a plastic knife, fork, and spoon, which we all love that concept, and I think it is a great one. It's called attritable. Some people call it attritable. As long as you recognize if you think you need anti-tamper for it, it's not attritable. So if you use it, you have to assume the adversary is going to take it, bring it back to the lab, and take it apart. So as long as you're willing to do that, and many times we are, that's okay, but it means that they'll figure out how you're doing your nav, and they'll jam you. And so the Russians have gotten really, really good. I'm surprised it took them this long, but it's not just the commercial UASs that are being affected, it's now starting to affect even the hardened military ones. So that I'm sure is going to extend into China.
Can I just throw a couple of things? So thanks to the Appit funding, we actually end up funding.
Sorry, the which funding?
The Appit, the one I was talking about. So we actually funded, or just let out a contract to a couple of contractors to be able to build a basically optical clock that can hold within 1 nanosecond across 10 days. So Appit's helping us to close some of the capabilities problems that we have. The other thing is, everybody knows lasers are, to build a big laser system, it's bulky, right? So we actually are funding a phase modulator in there that will reduce the cooling requirement by 50%. So that's going to low rate initial production, announced last week. So some of the things are going to help us in terms of the capabilities that we need in the future.
Got it. Somebody I think touched on asymmetry, and I wanted to talk a little bit or ask a little bit about that. I had an opportunity to be in the Red Sea on the Ike carrier and spent some time on a destroyer. We're all struck by the fight there, particularly with the Houthis, Iranian-backed militant group in Yemen, who are lobbing whatever, $100,000, $20,000 cheap one-way attack drones at ships, at commercial vessels and others. They're being shot down so far reasonably successfully by $1 or $2 million missiles. This is not sustainable. I wonder what your views are on where you're seeing other examples of asymmetry and and take an answer from all of you about what is being done to kind of narrow that gap to make the counter to some of these things more sustainable.
Well, I can start. I think, we can't really say much about it publicly. We won't say anything more that's already been said about the Iranian attack the other day against Israel. But to say that the cost matters, the cost curve matters, both the offense and defense. As a general rule, defense is usually more expensive than offense across the board, whether it's in cyber, missile defense, and other places. Number one. Number two is there's an old equation that says, what's missile defense? This is missile defense. Missile defense is an interceptor, battle management, and sensors. That is always going to cost more than a missile because it's more. It doesn't excuse it. I think where things are going on counter-UAS is I think that the price point we're going to need to get to, and we have a few candidate examples, is going to be in the tens of thousands per round. I think even over 100,000 per round is getting too expensive.
When?
What do you mean?
When do you think?
April 24th.
Okay. So you're seeing it now?
Actually, last week.
These kinds of things can be fielded at scale?
Oh, you're saying about where are we in terms of the capability?
Correct.
We have multiple examples of things that are promising, but they have to be proven. They have to be put into a battle management system. And so much of this is about what we call the buzzword of TTPs. It's about, can you train? What is the shot doctrine? Is it shoot, look, shoot? Is it shoot, shoot, look? And then are you doing it and Chris knows what I'm talking about. Are you doing combined ops? Are you doing the one counter-UAS system with another? And how are you making the decisions? All of that is really being learned, and then the adversary will change. Next week, they're going to fly differently, and it's changing that fast. And so we have this challenge of, we got to keep the price down. We also have to know that it's going to change really fast. And I'm all for software. I love software. I did the software study of the DSP. But you're not going to be able to do all the changes with software. You're going to need new sensors. So that's the race we're in right now.
Yeah, I think another dimension of what you're saying is there's a limitation to what you can do kinetically. And part of that is cost, but I think, part of it, we're starting to see it. The next generation drone threat is going to be swarming drones. And even if you have them, even if you have the money, you can't shoot them all down. There's going to be too many. So you're going to have to find something using power. I mean, it's going to be microwave. It's going to be jamming. It's going to be directed energies. But that's going to have to be the solution. Ultimately, that should be cheaper, but that's probably going to be secondary. It's the only thing that's going to be effective.
Yeah, that is the attraction of non-kinetic, is you effectively have a deep magazine, and it's very cheap. That's why everybody's attracted to it.
Right.
So obviously we're working on it.
Go on.
Obviously there's, I would just say on the laser side as an example, I won't talk HPM because that gets classified.
High-powered microwave.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, high-powered microwave. I won't talk about that. That gets very classified very quickly. But in the area lasers, for example, we know we've actually fielded, the Army has fielded 4 systems, but Marines had fielded them
There's a
way
bunch,
before.
There's a bunch fielded, the Navy's fielded them. We're getting the feedback all the time.
Exactly. And then what I'm working on is the generation after that, which is going to be delivered end of this year, much higher power. And then in the S&T side, we're delivering something that's tripling that. So multiple stages of development that's ongoing. Stuff that's fielded, stuff that will be delivered end of this year, okay, versus 3x more this power to be delivered and demonstrated end of next year. So there's staggered development that's ongoing.
Okay. Just a brief comment. I think we rightly focus a lot on kind of how we're on the business end of asymmetry, and counter-UAS air defense is a great example, and I can go on forever about that. I think the interesting lesson that we also need to apply is how we get on the right side of asymmetry and start imposing that on our adversaries, right? It's like we had to play counterinsurgent for 20 years. That wasn't very fun. Like, can we play insurgent for this next phase here and focus on how we counter an adversary's power projection? How do we field lots of low-cost things that can gum up the works and prevent them from projecting power? Many of the things that I think the Ukrainians are doing to the Russians in the early phases of the conflict, but we can't do that if our offensive strike weapons, for example, cost multiple millions of dollars. And if I'm going to be out of them in week 1 or week 2 of the war, as like 10 years of wargaming would suggest, and maybe that's true, maybe it's not. How do you build up a larger inventory of cheaper things that can begin to oppose, asymmetric costs on an adversary and generate deterrence as a function of it?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the Defense Science Board, the point Chris made, looked at turning the asymmetries, and not that they're the only ones that came up with this. They highlighted 2 concepts. One's proliferated constellations in space, which is already happening. That's clearly turning the asymmetry around, at least kinetically. The second was a concept called Assault Breaker, or Assault Breaker 2, which is more or less what Chris is describing. It's high volume of very inexpensive fires holding many, I think hundreds if not thousands of targets at risk combined with non-kinetics. Turn that asymmetry completely around. It is a DARPA program that's, parts of it remain. It's transitioning. But that was actually the concept behind it. But the piece of it that has to be done, and I think Chris and I haven't talked about this, but we agree, is where are those large number of very cheap things?
We were working very hard to build them for a government that has not yet demonstrated a desire to buy them.
There you go. Why?
Well, okay.
In terms of...
It's a good question for you.
Yeah. No, on the offensive side.
Yeah. So
my point is not to pick the fight. It's to say, where are those programs where
there's no fight to pick?
The services are investing in different kinds of weapons, changing their magazine from very exquisite things that they can't produce in large quantities to complement those. I mean, there's bright spots. There's parts of
What I would just say, and this is not at all an argument. I agree with Chris. If we can have companies out there which are produce things that will at low cost per all up round, will be reliable and do kills and work within a kill chain at large numbers, the government should be buying that today.
So,
yes.
Are there things? It sounds like there are things on the shelf that could be ready to be bought.
I guess, my only point is I'd like to see more of a demand signal in the form of programs and dollars beyond the rhetoric. I mean, I think we all agree that is a good aspiration. But when you then sort of go below it and say, okay, well, where are the military services fielding those programs and sending the demand signal that you mentioned earlier, not only to buy these capabilities, but to buy them at scale and to buy them as a function of time, such that I in industry say, oh man, I will absolutely invest to build that system because there is a demand that I want to respond to, rather than go on the hope that if I build it, they will come. And we know how often that works out.
I think in fairness that going on the build it and we will come is an unfair thing for industry because it puts industry in a bad situation. I think what we got to do is we got to come up with the concept, the integrated concept which we're talking about, and then begin the program to do it and do multiple vendors and look at what can be done. Let me look at positive. They did it in space with Space Development Agency. People thought you would not go to proliferated constellations. They're there now. Space Development Agency is buying commercial, buying them fixed price, $10 million a pop, and putting them up in space. That's happened. We can do it here too.
Totally agree.
Where Well, I want to ask one quick question. You mentioned about TTPs. Does the Pentagon bureaucracy and the services and whatever step in their own way when it comes to like actually fielding some technology? I think like there's been some sense that the Navy's been a little bit hesitant on directed energy, for example, where there might be opportunities where they could actually field it and maybe even put it into play. Correct me if I'm wrong. Put it into play in real world now, and it's not as much present as it could be, because out of fear that it needs to be kind of tested and everybody needs to be completely.
The Navy does have directed energy.
They have it, yeah.
They have it on ship. Okay.
It's in Norfolk.
They've been testing it out. Okay, so what we're looking at is even a higher energy. Let's see, 5 times higher power.
Yeah.
That will be delivered end of this year to them. So they will absolutely take that system and certainly test it out and understand the TTPs, because you have to understand TTP. When do you use kinetic? When do you use directed energy? And they have to flesh that out.
Sure. I mean, they can't just like try it out,
So
but I mean.
I chair, co-chair, I think it is, a CounterUAS senior integration group, which is really moving things into theater right now. We just started a month ago. We meet every 2 weeks. Had it yesterday. The Navy, PEO IWS, and I'll just limit what I can say publicly, in June is going a whole series of tests with their frigates, where they're putting a whole series of counter-UAS systems, many of which we know about. They have them on the ships, and they're going to be doing demos. And the whole idea is to look at a layered defense that would go as far out as the Standard Missile family, and then interim steps back in. And how do you integrate that into the digital twin of Aegis and get it into fire control? They're doing that right now. The PEO there in IWS is a remarkable and one of the most innovative people I've ever met. So they're doing it.
But let me just, if I could, I agree with Heidi. The Navy is trying to develop directed energy weapons, and they're certainly moving in the right direction. I think though it has to be a whole of service effort, in that the next generation surface combatant, they're not committed to putting the electric power on the ship that you need
for
that directed. I mean, the current generation of power is at the ragged edge of our current propulsion and sensors. When you add electronic warfare and then eventually directed energy, you're going to need a multiple, which you're not going to be able to do. You have to go electric.
Is that because?
Yet, nevertheless, we're going down a path that's, I think, short-sighted, that's not looking out. Next generation surface combatants will be around 40 or 50 years. We're clearly going to have directed energy weapons then. We're going to have more sophisticated. We're going to have a multiple of power demands. We need to have a power infrastructure that supports that, and that decision needs to be made now, and it needs to be in line with the overall. And that's
is that because they're not sure, 5 years from now, what those combatants?
No, I think it's because they're different segments developing different things on different timelines. I don't think it's.
To their credit, I mean, Bill knows this. In certain places, they've done incredible work on electric drive over the last 20, 30 years. The question is, can we make it scalable and cost effective? Yeah. But it's to your point.
But I'm saying we have to.
Well, I think we have to. Yeah, we have to. Can't just have it on carriers and SSPNs.
Go ahead.
I'll say I just came from a meeting in which I spent 2 hours with the Air Force and the Navy, literally looking at high-power microwave system. So it's a positive side here. The services are actually working together. The Air Force and the Navy, they were in the room at the same time, and literally the Navy showed, here's exactly it's going to go, here's the requirements, and the system, that scale that the Air Force is working, they're taking the Air Force system that's finished demonstrating, put it onto the Navy. So, pretty awesome.
I think I've mentioned this before. We have a spreadsheet of all the counter-UAS systems that are out there, including prototypes that the labs are doing. Everybody's doing them, and it's now up to 50. And the issue is, the right thing is now we're using the JCO, which is the Army-led Joint Capability Office, to winnow that list down to the ones that seem to be working. We're doing tests all the time. And then we got to get them through SIG over the hump and get them into production and get the contracts out. That's the job at hand. So there's really incredible, every idea you can think of for counter-UAS. There's acoustics. There's non-acoustics. There is using existing air-to-air weapons. There's using, I mean, what the Ukrainians are doing, they're putting iPhones around the country that are detecting the acoustic signal. And they're sending it into a centralized, basically data center that then sends it out to mobile fire teams. There's huge innovation happening there. We just got to get this stuff into scale.
Let me, I have questions from the audience I want to get to, and I really do. I'm not just going to pay lip service. They're good questions. But I did want to ask one thing, is just kind of pointedly. You're both, or all four of you are on different sides, industry, government, and you must have frustrations and victories at the end of some days. Can each of you give me one success story that you're particularly proud of, and one like where you're like, God damn it, can't make this thing work? I'd like to hear, just, you know, because you're both, or because you're all on different sides of the street on that one.
Oh, we absolutely have success stories. I can't get into the details.
You can't. Yeah, but you got to give us something.
I'll give you something. So,
not everything's classified.
So I'm going to speak very generically this way, okay? 2.5 years ago, when I first walked into the Pentagon, SecDef literally asked me to lay out what are the things we can do to counter hypersonics. So we laid out the entire kill chain, pre-launch to terminal, and talk about all the things we can go after every single phase. And DepSecDef liked it. He said, lay out the details. I laid out the details, got funded, which is unbelievable. I walked into a DMAG, you know how DMAG, how painful usually it is? I spoke for...
I vaguely remember.
You vaguely remember this. I spoke for 4 minutes with no charts and got all the money I needed. Okay?
Maybe you should never bring charts.
I should never bring charts. The lessons learned. But what we did immediately was to start executing. And we IOC some capabilities last month.
Can we know what those are?
Absolutely not, because China will find out.
Was there like a goddammit question, answer? Like, I wish we could get this thing through faster, and the government's in the way, industry's not doing their part quickly?
I think...
Gotta have some frustrations.
But we worked through it. We absolutely worked through it. Here's the problem, okay? You get folks...
Permission to speak freely.
Yes. You get technical folks who really want to get things down. They need particular information from other organizations. Sometimes that doesn't always flow.
Right.
So they bash their head against the wall. You get different layers of management help until it bubbles up to me. I find out the problem, and I just send, bang, one email, and I got that solved.
Okay.
I just wish I found out 6 months earlier.
All right. So,
Yeah, success, a couple examples. One of which I've talked about, which is the within 3 weeks, taking harpoons off a European surface ship, putting them on in containers on flatbed trucks with the power sources, connecting the cable, training the Ukrainians in Europe somewhere, and then they were firing it successfully and sinking ships in the Black Sea. The whole thing within 3 weeks. There's also a series of, if you think about we call it air to ground is what we call it euphemistically, but think about the aircraft that the Ukrainians have, and not even the F-16s, but they have a lot of the Russian and Soviet era aircraft. Working with the Ukrainians, we've been able to take many Western weapons and get them to work on their aircraft where it's basically controlled by an iPad by the pilot, and they're flying it in conflict like a week after we get it to them. There's stories like that all over. On the other hand, I have another story which would have been was the first 3 chapters were like, here's a success story. One company, I won't say who they are, they came up with a really cool idea of taking an air-to-ground weapon and doing a ground-launched version of it, and it would be a long-range fire weapon, and they raced and did it as fast as they could. We even limited the testing in this country. We said, look, just test for safety. Otherwise, the operational testing will be non-cooperative with the Russians. And so then we sent it to the Ukrainians. It didn't work. It didn't work for multiple reasons, including EMI environment, including just really the dirt and doing it on ground, the TTPs, the dot mill. It just didn't work. And what happens is when you send something to people in the fight of their lives that doesn't work, they'll try it 3 times and then they'll just throw it aside. So that's happened too.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the success story identifies that even before Ukraine, the Army had identified that short-range air defense, which had been strong during the Cold War and atrophied, turned out the Taliban didn't have an air force. What we saw with China and now ultimately Ukraine, we needed short-range air defense. We were working with the Forces Command. We're able to take basically existing technology on we did use charts, on a PowerPoint, and we took that PowerPoint and got it to first prototype in 18 months, which is light speed in the Pentagon. So failures for us, I think our biggest challenge is we've never been successful in moving to, not never, but it's hard for us to move to commercial. We have defense technology that has commercial applications, but then we find our cost point isn't right. We don't have the sales force. We don't have the right approach to pricing. And so the idea of moving into commercial is we think we could do it, but then we find, no, we don't, our reflexes are wrong.
Okay, there, Chris, go for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples that I could point at. There's work that we're doing on CounterUAS with SOCOM that doesn't get a lot of airtime. Partly, initially, it was for classification reasons, and then maybe government bureaucratic reasons. But we've been in the middle of that fight for 5 years, downrange as a company. Starting as a very small company to now a larger company. And I would submit that what we've been able to do is what SOCOM refers to as their systems integration partner. Is take an open, modern software system enabled by artificial intelligence and machine learning and rapidly integrate third-party sensors and effectors to compose families of systems that are right for soft units that are deploying to different geographies, facing different threats, all of which are metastasizing in real time. And that pace of integration, adaptation, and integrating everything, high-powered microwave, directed energy, kinetics, non-kinetics, most of which Anduril does not build, but integrating it quickly into useful systems that I would argue critically are systems that are intuitive, that do not take months of training or lots of FSRs or specialized operators to operate, but are fundamentally scalable and based on autonomy. How do I get that human being on the decision loop or on the kill chain so that we can actually scale the way that we fight against an adversary that's throwing large amounts of weapons at us. I personally think and obviously I'm biased in this, I think that's how we're going to have to solve this. And out of that kind of process of adaptation came the Roadrunner system that Bill's very familiar with and has been a champion of. Again, a threat that we identified with our government partner, turned very quickly into a capability that was downrange inside of 2 years. That's not going to work for forever, but that pace of change, adaptation, and rapid fielding, all enabled by modern software practices and open integration, I think is how we get there.
I just want to comment without talking about any one company, but I do want to compliment some of the companies that Chris alluded to that are doing exactly what he said. They understand this is an integration problem as much as anything else. They understand this adaptability is the issue. They understand the scale is the issue. So again, I think that as companies start to listen and actually put their money against it, we in the government, you have to follow through and make sure there's landing pads fair for this stuff to get played. And I think that's a positive thing that's happening.
Notice, audience, if you have some questions, I think it will magically appear here on my iPad. I'm going to ask a couple of them here. But this is a good, nice broad one for some defense hands. Since the infamous Last Supper, to what degree has industry consolidation been a source of our current lack of acquisition flexibility? And how, if you agree, how do you repair the damage? That's from Tony Spadaro.
Well, I think repairing the damage, if you will, the thing is every time we get new competitors in, it's repairing the damage. So I would say, knock on wood, the space, the launch arena and the space overall arena, we've got now people in that business that were not in it before. That's really good. That goes against Last Supper. The second that you have other companies able to take, for lack of a better word, munitions, but that's not the right word. I would use it, maybe UAS, counter-UAS, that world with rocket motors, with that beyond the normal companies, and add to it with a different concept, different price point. That's good. That does the Last Supper. Let me tell you the implications of the consolidation. The implication of the consolidation is, for example, the Sentinel, which is a replacement for Minuteman III, that was essentially sole sourced. It was sole sourced, it wasn't essentially sole sourced. Because we only had in this country 2 solid rocket motor makers, we still really only do, that are certified, and one of them decided not to bid, and so it was really sole sourced. It was right there. You want to see the Last Supper effect? Look right there. Look at that. Look at the, I'm a big believer in the B-21. I had to say, I had played a role in that. Thankfully, we had 2 industry teams to bid on that. Barely. That's the Last Supper. And I'm just talking about major platforms, not talking about the new stuff. So these are all the implications that people and companies behave differently when there's competition. That's the implication.
I'd like to add one thing. But I think if you look into the future, especially in the area of biotech, right, it will bring a whole slew of new players that we currently don't have, okay? We are soon going to be awarded a number of companies to develop next generation energetics material using biotech, next generation of biofuel, next generation of a lot of capability that doesn't exist today. So this is where the new companies will be formed to create capabilities that DoD can then benefit.
John, anything?
Yeah, no, I actually was in the Pentagon during the Last Supper, and
As I figured.
yeah, the Last Supper
Who
was
got the check? It's always wondered who got the check.
Bill Perry got
Yeah,
the
that's
check.
what I thought.
But it was a logical response to the end of the Cold War. We weren't building, we didn't have as many tank lines, as many helicopter. You couldn't support the industry we had. The industry had a logical response. The question is, it shouldn't be a permanent response. It's how do you, as you're saying, how do you get new entrants in new fields? We have a series of companies at the top layer, but what's also happened is the mid-tier has evacuated. We need to build up the mid-tier. It's not so much we need more big companies. The mid-sized ones can compete with the big ones in certain areas. You need to build up that mid-tier area. There are antidotes to, as I say, it was a logical response. It just shouldn't be a permanent one. We need to now take steps to deal with the capacity issues we have, to deal with the need to bring those new technologies in, to improve competition. There are answers to all those questions, but we have to be proactive in pushing it.
Very good.
He's too young.
We had a $1 billion, the President signed a $1 billion sub package this morning. This says a lot of stuff finally for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. I'm curious if in that $1 billion anybody would flag money earmarked specifically for innovation. But then also, Bill, from my colleague, Tony Capaccio at Bloomberg, he's asking, the White House and DoD outlined a new Ukraine PDA, including new stocks of 155mm shells and other systems. What's the state of that production today? And can it support this new surge?
I have the numbers right here, sorry. The numbers right now is that we're on the path now with the supplemental. We'll be at 100,000 a month in 2025. So that's where we'll be. Right now, we're somewhere between 30 and 40,000 a month.
Okay.
So one thing that again, with the caveat of what I said earlier about you can't do apples and apples because it's not necessarily how we would fight, but the surrogate for the 155, maybe for the Russians, is 152 for them. And so I always try to draw on my back of the envelope is, what do I think the West is on 155? And I use it as a surrogate. So I do my own estimate. I know what we're producing, but I kind of know what's going. I have a pretty good estimate of what's going on around the world. I think I do. And this isn't about promising. This isn't about in the future. It's about where you're delivering right now today. And then you look at what's in the open source about where Russia is on 152. And that's one of the races we're on. You can imagine both of those curves, and you want to make sure that our curve is better than their curve. I'm watching that very carefully. And again, knowing that 155 and 152 is not the end all be all, but it's a surrogate of kind of how people are mobilizing. But the 155 situations were pretty good, actually. We've got multi-years now that were done last year. There's a totally new facility being built in Texas. We're shipping equipment, the Army is, from Turkey, that's going to build this up. It's going to be able to produce lots of different munitions. We're going to be good in 155. And the issue was we couldn't send any, really, for months because of the drawdown. Yeah.
Could I
Yeah.
add to that? So on the R&E side, what we're looking at is tripling the range as 155 with one of the rocket motors. And that's being demonstrated in terms of capability. So that's
When could
next.
when could that longer range be fielded?
Well, we have to ramp up the production, but
Like at the same production that he's talking about, or a different production?
it's a different production.
There's a category we call long-range fires, which, depending on your range, is either 150 plus. And there's a whole series of candidates that are being looked at for that. That's sort of where this is all eventually headed, whereas 155 is nominally a 30-kilometer weapon.
Another question from Colby Badwar, the Insider. Given, and it's kind of on the same theme, given continued FMS demand for new ATACMS, is the Army concerned that this will impact Lockheed's ability to scale up precision strike missile production? How many need to be test fired before it is approved for full rate production? I think that's a question.
For PRISM?
For full rate, yeah.
For PRISM. Yeah, it's funny, just coincidentally, we just talked to Lockheed yesterday about all this. I think they'll be fine. The Army has already delivered, Lockheed has already delivered like about 30-ish, I defer to Doug Bush, PRISMs to the Army that they're already testing right now. I think it's also been announced that Lockheed has announced that they're going to be doing a PRISM production line in Australia. So they're all over the fact of what we need to do to continue the ATACMS line and PRISM. It's, in this country, it's down in Camden, Arkansas. It's actually the same facility. But yeah, they're working through it. They're able to do it. They're able to do it.
Are there other, which is back to my kind of other original question about this $1 billion, is there other stuff that anybody else would point to that might be in that $1 billion package that you would hail as being money spent on some of the stuff we're talking about and getting more tech fielded, more stuff in the hoppers? I don't know if even that's the right question, but it's $1 billion, so it seems like there should be some money in there for kind of what we're talking about is like accelerating technology.
Well, just to be clear, if I understand it right, the president announced the drawdown, right?
Right.
So drawdown is what is
replenishment, right?
Yeah.
No, it's what's in our. It's actually what's in our inventory.
Right.
Literally, what do we have in our shelves? So you'd have to have something that's high tech in your shelves. I think to your question.
Yeah.
To ship to them.
I guess I thought that some of that money was for USAI.
No, it's confusing. I'll try to do it for 101. I always get confused. Okay, so there's what's in the supplemental that matters, sort of the DoD main part. The money is what's called replenishment, and the other is, as you referred to, USAI. Separate from both of those is what's called the drawdown authority. Right. That's an amount of money, valuation, if you will, of equipment we can give to them. The advantage of drawdown is you can do it immediately. That's why airplanes are flying today, right? So it's literally what do we have in our inventory to give to them. Now, the replenishment allows us to go and say, to replenish those gimblers that we've provided in this last thing, we want to replenish those with more gimblers, or even if you wanted to say, if the argument made with something else that's comparable, we can get that on contract. So does that make sense?
Yeah. By the way, is there any way to speak to the stuff that is being sent to Israel, to what degree that is, as we've seen in Ukraine, obviously a depletion of America's own 155 round stocks? Are there concerns there? Can you speak publicly? I know it's a sensitive thing, but can you speak publicly to the concerns of the stuff that is being shipped over to Israel and what impact that has on America's own?
I think, right at the beginning of all this, back in October, I think just because we didn't know, there was a lot of just finding out what was needed in different places. I think it's been sort of sorted out. I think it's been sorted out. there's been some degree of deconfliction that had to be done with industrial base, but I think we're okay.
This is more of a policy question, but I mean, if the Middle East conflict, as it's kind of defined today, becomes much more protracted, when do you get concerned that?
It depends I know that this is I apologize for the answer. It depends how. Like, for example, the Iranian event that happened a week and a half ago was pretty unique. Unique in that what they did and what was done to the credit of our allies and partners to defend against it. It's different than what's going on, say, in Israel, right next to Israel, say, with some of their fighting, which is also different than what CENTCOM is dealing with strikes from Iranian affiliated groups on U.S. bases. So or what AFRICOM's dealing with. AFRICOM's dealing with some of this stuff as well. What we're watching, though, is where a technique or a capability that's just isolated here all of a sudden pops over here. And of course, then looking at that and how it compares to what's going on with Ukraine, because of course the Iranians are a player there as well. And so you kind of watch all of them at the same time and see when does one tactic or one technology pop into another area.
Right. We've kind of touched on this, but this is just a colorful question, so I'm going to ask it anyway, from Peter Humphrey. I still get the sense that we are buying one Rolls-Royce instead of 5 Volkswagens. When are we going to brave the swarm? Quantity is its own quality of its own.
Who said that?
Peter Humphrey.
No, it's Joseph Stalin, actually. Quantity is its own quality, apparently.
I don't know who said that.
Well, no.
He said it today.
It's like most Winston Churchill quotes he never said. But
anyway, we've touched on this, but I mean, as we wrap up, I'd love to get...
I think it's the conversation we've been having, which is, I mean, look, I think we got to get into the vocabulary of people, cost per all-up round, or whatever we call flyaway costs. As we talked earlier, if it's $10,000 versus $100,000 versus $1 million, just have that in the conversation and say, you know, and companies need to come in, and I mean, I've challenged some of our companies to say, Chris knows this, I've challenged our companies to say, okay, I want to show me how you get your production line up to thousands per year, and then show me the APUC is what's called, the non-recurring, take the non-recurring away, what's the cost per unit come down to? And then, because then, of course, quantity matters for how much it costs per unit. And we're lining all these things up and looking at where are the cost per units coming down versus effectiveness on counter-UAS. And that's why I'm really excited about some possibilities of even some counter-UAS capabilities per round that could be at $10,000. So that's where the whole conversation is right now, is about that. Now, I would take the point that Chris rightfully made, which is we have to get these into volume of programs and get these into large buys. But we now have, with the supplementals, I think we have an opportunity to get that started.
Just real quick, what does all that money for DIU mean for, in this agreement, mean for essentially getting some of the stuff that Chris is just talking about? You know, you get kind of initially in, and then when it comes down to the details, it's going to be a little harder. Is that money for DIU, which I think is like $800 million, is that going to be helpful at all in helping?
Sure.
Like
sure.
How?
Well, I think what we want DIU to do is be talking to, I mean, they can talk to the people we're talking to, because we all talk to some of the same people, but then talk to the people that we don't even know about. That's what, I talked to Doug Beck. I said, Doug, you guys on CounterUAS, I need you to be out there finding all the people that we're not talking to us, and get them going, get them prototyping, get them into the mix here, and then we can start, if we can pick some that are really show promise, get them into production. The production is going to happen with the services. And that's to the point we got to make the services have to be ready to take this on. But we're willing to push that. But the $800 million is a way to really front load that with non-traditionals and doing it fast. It's all helpful.
Okay. Anything else anybody wants to say? I think we're coming to the near of our ending here. I want to thank the panel so much. For those of you who are wondering why I'm wearing this button, I just want to say please think about my colleague Evan Gerskovich, who's in jail in Russia wrongfully, and please think about him. Anyway, please join me in welcoming and thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone. Just a reminder, we will break now. We will be back at 3:30. Please stay for that panel. We've been building toward it all day. We're going to focus really from the defense industrial base towards game changers and emerging technology. So we've saved a fantastic panel for last. Please stay, and we will get started promptly at 3:30. So thank you.